Debt is one of the most commonly avoided conversations in any household.
Credit card debt, credit card debt.
Now, while Peter Griffin and Glenn Quagmire enjoy singing a song about it, we as Canadians hate talking about it. It's almost like we just know it's so bad, so we just avoid it altogether.
Why confront something when you can avoid it, right?
Why confront something when you can just avoid it? Just like us, governments all over the world have been tackling the issue of debt. Now, in our conversation today, we're discussing Canada's debt. Is it a crisis? We'll be covering terminology like debt to GDP and personal debt. So firstly, I'd like to turn to Vince to give us an explanation very simply.
Okay.
When we're using the term debt to GDP or debt to income, what does that mean?
Well, debt to GDP is essentially when you look at a country's gross domestic product, how much or what percentage of that gross domestic product would it take to pay off a country's national debt?
Okay, so gross domestic product being what the country creates, like how much it produces in value?
In goods and services.
Got you. Okay, now debt to income, how would you explain that?
Well, how much debt encompasses one's income, basically. So what percentage of one's income is attributed to debt?
Got you. And that is a individual Canadian on an individual level.
Yeah.
Okay, good. We'll turn it back. So to put it in perspective, I thought these stats were really interesting. The United States is $36 trillion in debt. Japan's around $10 trillion in debt. Canada is around $1.3 trillion in debt. Well, when you add up the debt to GDP of all the provinces in Canada, you get 108%. The US is actually in some way close by at 118%, so only 10% more. That's concerning as a Canadian. And just to have some more fun, the total global debt to GDP, the amount of valued product the world creates versus its total debt, 333%. So this isn't just a Canadian issue. The total amount of debt in the world, governments, businesses, and individuals is more than 3 times the value of all the goods and services produced globally in a year. Keep in mind, 60 to 80% debt to GDP ratio is considered sustainable. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. I'm sorry to I just threw a hammer on that whole conversation, but Vince, Jay, Anthony, thank you for joining me.
Our pleasure.
Great to be here.
Okay, so I wanted to start, who's to blame for this debt?
Oh, boy.
Because you see, I just got to clear the air here, because you see it on social media, somebody's to blame. Who's to blame? Who's to blame, guys? Come on. Jay, who's to blame?
Look, I mean, ultimately, it's our politicians that borrow the money. That's the bottom line. Of course, we vote for those politicians. So in a sense, voters also have to take accountability, but it's the politicians that ultimately deliver deficit budgets and
would you say it's just the way that the system's done? Take on debt, use that to say you're growing the economy?
No.
It's an excuse. Yeah.
I think it's an excuse. Here's the thing. At the end of the day, we need to learn to say no. And we're to blame as voters. We're voting in the politicians. They're spending the money. We don't want them to say no, but they should say no. And so what happens is it's like everything is free. Everyone thinks in Canada everything is free. Well, at the end of the day, it's not free. We're paying for it, and we're paying for it through debt.
Well, this is the thing. The question is, do you want higher taxes? Do you want lower spending? Some people will just say, well, we don't want higher taxes. We still want the higher spending. Borrow the money. We'll worry about it later. But we can't do that as households, because eventually it comes home to roost. And it will come home to roost for us, with governments as well.
I laugh because, you're not wrong. I think we as just individuals I think there's an expectation misalignment a little bit. Anthony, I want to let you jump in on this. What do you think?
I think people will see my facial expression when you're talking about the debt of the entire planet. Now I know why everybody wants to go to Mars. Not a bad idea. No, you know what? I have a different opinion on debt and a different view on debt. My whole thing is, what's it doing? What is it encompassing? So are we taking on a couple billions of dollars in debt because we want to build a bridge that crosses a roadway, create more trade, decrease trade barriers, improve industry confidence? Are we taking on debt because Canadians need healthcare, because we have to provide more services for people? I'm not against taking on debt, but I do think it should be the government's responsibility to have a payment plan back and to do it in a fiscally responsible way. We've done it before. We can do it again. Yeah. And I think the financial calamity that's happened because of COVID is another lesson learned. And there's a blueprint of what to do and what not to do in the future.
But before COVID, we also had massive amounts of debt. And so I think what you're talking about is ROI. What is the ROI if we're going to build the road?
Okay, I want to leave it there, because part of our conversation is on good debt versus bad debt, and what is that? And I mean, it's really subjective, but we'll be right back to continue the conversation.
I'ma rule the world, I'ma rule the world, yeah. I'ma rule the world, I'ma rule the world, yeah.
I'm loving the show because in the previous segment, we were talking about really who's to blame. And I guess you can't really point the finger at one particular person. Is it us as human beings, as voters? Is it the politicians? I don't know. But my question is, do we set our governments up to fail? I mean, we vote in leaders who give us services. But then when the economy is hurting, we elect a new leader who will get us out of the turmoil, which you could maybe say we're in now. But are we just impatient as a culture that we don't give them enough time to proactively work towards fixing the issue of paying off the debt, which will take decades? On to your point about how we don't want to hear no from our politicians. So we're the problem.
Absolutely.
Okay.
100%.
So now what in the world do we do about that?
You know
I don't
what?
know.
But you get in situations like Canada did in the 1990s, where the debt was such a problem that there was a consensus in the country that we really had to deal with it. And you had politicians of multiple stripes. You had the Liberals at the federal level, you had the Progressive Conservatives in Ontario, who recognized we got to buckle down, we got to balance our books, we got to pay down debt, and we did it. And so I think it's an expectation shift from both voters. What do we expect from our politicians? But when does the recognition come from voters that actually this is a problem and we do have to balance the books and we do have to start paying this down?
I mean, when there's an interesting stat, it was our debt to income in Canada is 181%, which means for every $100 that a Canadian makes, is this accurate that they're $181 in debt? Is that reality? Like that? Just when I hear that, it just sounds like we're setting ourselves up to fail. Like, why not just pay off a huge portion of the debt for the next 10 years? But nobody wants to be the political leader to do that
Well,
because that's not glamorous.
Yeah, when was the last time anybody said, like a political leader said, we can't afford it?
Like, Anthony, you love politics.
Yeah.
You love the drama a little bit.
If I ran, I'd say no for a few
Okay.
things, for sure.
Okay, but a leader goes on
We'll vote you in.
stage and is like, guys, I'm going to get elected and you may not see a lot of new services, but I'll pay down the debt and that'll make life cheaper. But you got to give me 10 years. Like, people aren't going to go for that.
That's a lot of asks.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Like-
let's start from the top. Canadians have to decide what kind of country they want. Do we want a country with Ferrari services and we want to pay Toyota prices? That's not going to happen. Do we want a country that doesn't feel anymore like it's overtaxed and underserved, which I would bet most Canadians feel right now? Do we want a country that delivers services in a practical way, has the accessibility that we've promised? And do we have politicians that have the gall to tell the truth? That needs to be it.
There's a tension, though, between like services, but then, okay, do we need those services if we pay down the debt a good portion and then we're saving $30 billion a year?
I think there's also a question of services and are they delivered well and are they delivered in a cost-effective manner?
Yeah.
Because sometimes we're spending, for example, healthcare here in Ontario, around the country. People increasingly feel like healthcare isn't working, that you're waiting too long, that you don't have access to doctors. The solution that politicians have thrown out in recent years is spend more money, spend more money, spend more money, without addressing some of the fundamental problems with the system. And I think that's a problem with politicians generally and in politics. It's a question of throw money at the problem and just say, we're addressing it. We're trying.
I love this word. What sounds sexier to people? We're going to invest $6 billion in healthcare, or have a seat with me and I'm going to show you why this dated system from the 1970s isn't working in 2025.
Wait, could you say we're going to invest $6 billion into healthcare in 3 years because we're going to actually run a budget surplus for the next 3 years and then use that to pay into healthcare?
Who could forecast a budget surplus for 3 years? Nobody knows what the economy is going to do.
Yeah, you're right. And I actually when I spoke to Joe Oliver,
Yeah.
former finance minister, he actually said, you can't really forecast it. You can't,
No.
It's crazy to say that you're going to balance the budget next year, but you could say, okay, we have a game plan and a target to say in 2-3 years, we'll run a surplus. Vince, you got something to say?
Well, I also worry about giving a government $6 billion and just give them carte blanche, because at the end of the day, we see is there's leakage, right? There's inefficiencies in government.
So you're talking like Doge,
Yeah.
Department of Government
Oh boy.
Efficiency.
Well, I'm just
Doge.
saying in general, what happens is that if you just give someone money easily, just like that, they're going to find a way to spend it, and it's not always going to be the most efficient way.
Okay, but when we talk about Doge, we got 40 seconds here. Let's have some fun. Donald Trump comes in, says, we got to spend less money. So he brings in people that aren't even politicians to say, you guys got to just cut everything that is inefficient like you would in a business. Does Canada need that a little bit?
I don't know how well the work.
Because-
I don't know what a Doge department would do in Canada, but that's already causing problems with the Republican Congress and the Republican Senate. That's all optics.
But the idea of it, though.
Okay, but that means saying no to something, and saying no doesn't get you votes, unfortunately. We've seen that.
Well, how about saying no to some of the bonuses at the Crown Corps, the fancy bonuses?
Okay, I got 5 seconds here. That's a good way to end it. We'll be right back to keep this conversation flowing.
I'ma rule the world, I'ma rule the world, yeah. I'ma rule the world, I'ma rule the world, yeah.
We hear financial planners talk about this, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. If you've heard of the book, it's widely known as a financial book. And even the World Bank talk about how there is good debt and bad debt. I know I heard my dad talk about it while growing up. It's just that, of course, it'll never be that simple. Good and bad are subjective to what you feel are good investments. And that's where the argument always stems from. In a previous segment, there was one thing I wanted to bring up. And if I could get one of you guys to give me a 20-second, 30-second of what the worst thing that could happen is, let's take a look at Greece. It was like, it's like 200% debt to GDP, or don't quote me on that, but it was something like that. And then the economy just goes poop. Jay, do you have some knowledge on Greece? Can you kind of elaborate on what happened there?
Well, what happened is the percentage that the government was bringing in terms of taxes that they had to allocate to debt interest was just skyrocketing. And so not only did they have to raise taxes, they had to also cut spending on services. And so in Canada, we're positioned at the federal level right now. We're actually spending more on debt interest than they bring in through the federal sales tax. But imagine that on steroids. So imagine that you're spending more on debt interest than you bring in, say, through income taxes.
So what you're saying is like, I think Canada brings around $550 billion a year, and then we were spending like $200 billion a year on
imagine
debt.
a massive portion of your budget, 30, 40, you're getting really up there, just has to go
But
to
then
debt.
what's the breaking point? I don't want to spend too much time on this, but what's the breaking point? Like, at what point does everything just break? Why can't you just keep going in more debt? Because eventually somebody wants their money?
Well, but also, who wants to lend it to you?
Right.
Oh, so they'll stop lending it to the banks, will stop lending it to the government. Interesting, and that's where the
Not
breaking
every
point
country
happens.
is the United States of America.
Well, but then I find it interesting. The U.S. kind of holds the pyramid there, where they could basically say as well, if the U.S. goes under, if the U.S. crashes, then the whole world's done. So let's just keep taking advantage of that and keep taking on debt. Okay, all right, that mind boggled now. Go ahead, Vince.
It's also think of the idea of compound interest.
Yeah.
So if you take a secured line of credit today and you just rack it up and then you never make a payment, the interest will continue to accrue and it will compound.
So what I'm hearing right now is Canada is a fantastic banking system. They're doing okay. We're not where we were at in the 90s. That's what I've heard on, Andrew Chang, CBC. I love him. He does a great job. Like, that's what we're hearing. But one of the things that I was looking into, you're going to laugh.
Oh boy.
An investment into a bowl that cooks pasta is seen as good debt. But when you invest into the pasta, it's seen as bad debt because it's just being consumed. There's no actual tangible investment. Do we feel Canada is leaning more into just that consumable debt versus like strong investment? I'll let you start.
I think based on what we've come out of, it probably feels and looks that way. But
Okay.
I also know that there is going to come a time where the federal government is going to change. And I think on the panel, we can agree that that's going to be sooner than later. There will be a new vision for the country. There will be a new vision on what we spend money or don't spend money on, and that will change. I always...
So that tension kind of
yes,
balances
and I
things.
always reference COVID because in a lot of arguments about debt, a lot of people conveniently forget to bring that up. That's a reason why there's a lot of it there right now. So whatever the direction happens to be, I hope there is some fiscal prudence, but not at the risk of services for Canadians.
Jay, what are some things that we have to invest in as a country that are seen as good investments?
Well, I think when we had this conversation about certain infrastructure projects, obviously, as you said, if it's things that you're actually going to invest in, that you're going to use, that have a value added to the country, that's something. But I think we also...
So like the new highway that Ford's proposing?
Well, I mean, you can get into debate over whether the highway is in the right spot and all these other things.
I know I'm just pressing a button with people here, but...
But what I would say is there's always a balance. And if you want to invest in the things that you want to invest in, you also have to make sure that your books are in order. And when we're in a situation right now where, for example, the federal government they forecasted, the parliamentary budget officer, we're not going to have a balanced budget until well into the 2040s at the current rate. And that's if they don't add more spending, which is probably going to happen in the next budget, potentially,
Vince,
depending on who's in the
I want to
government.
throw it to you. I mean, there's a lot of ammo that I guess I'll give you here, but when we look at Canadian household debt, because this isn't just Canadian debt or federal debt, but 74% of consumer debt is mortgages, 8.5% on credit cards. Is a mortgage a good debt, and are credit cards a bad debt? Like, can we be objective on that? You've got like 20
Yeah,
seconds
no, I
here.
would agree for sure. I mean, it's the purpose of the debt. The purpose of the debt is for your home and for you to live in. And the goal is for you to pay it off at some point, hopefully. But it's also what you're doing with consumer debt. And why is consumer debt continuing to be racked up? Number one, it's easily accessible. You can get a credit card really easily and multiple credit cards really easily.
Right.
And many people, unfortunately, take those cards and continue to add it onto the home.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Jumping into the fourth segment already. This is flown by, but I'm loving this conversation. We will be right back. Stay tuned.
I'ma rule the world, I'ma rule the world, yeah. I'ma rule the world, I'ma rule the world, yeah.
I hope my stats are right here because this is just really hard to believe. In 2023, 2024, the federal and provincial governments together are expected to spend $81.8 billion on interest rates. Does that sound about right, Jay? Okay, good to know. That's more than healthcare transfers to the provinces at $53 billion. So even when you bring up healthcare, it's a scary thing. The average Canadian owes $20,000 in student loans, $21,000 in car loans, and $14,000 in personal loans. That's not even including a mortgage. What in the world do we do about this? So you guys probably laugh because, you know, you've been around a little bit longer than I have. I say that in a nice way. But I'm looking at this like the world is 300 plus trillion in debt. US is this much in debt. Canada's this. How much longer can we go? So this is my question. Is there even a point to paying off our debt? Should we make paying off our debt a goal? Will we ever see that number be zero? Will Canada ever pay off $1.34 trillion? I'm going to throw this to you.
No,
No.
they never will. And
So it's unrealistic to expect that?
oh, absolutely, I think so. But I also think that if we're going to put like some type of effort into doing it, it shouldn't be on the asset and infrastructure portion. There's a lot of bad debt that the government's taken on, and I think that needs to be the
But what would
priority.
be
And I
like
think
bad debt.
Yeah.
Okay, we saw Canadian dental care plan. We saw $10 a day child care, pharma care. Those are like really expensive services that have come out of this
They are.
government.
Yeah, they are. But let's talk about the debt from COVID before everybody else jumps in quickly. That would be something I would be prioritizing maybe in this field. Maybe we all can agree on that. That's something that was financed a little too short term for most people's liking, I think.
Yeah.
So maybe that could be put on the priority list for paying down quicker. It did have its benefits, but maybe that's something. I
wanna
wouldn't be
throw this-
rushing to pay down infrastructure.
I want to throw this to you guys because I understand there's good debt, there's bad debt, but to what point? $82 billion in interest payments.
Well, it's scary. It's scary, that amount. And you got to think and again, you talk about COVID, but a few short years ago, we were paying about half that in
Are
debt
you
interest
kidding me?
payments.
Right before COVID, we paid about half that.
Yeah, in debt interest payments. So
That's-
it's really
wow,
soared, and
wow.
part of it has to do with higher interest rates, and part of it has to do with everything that was taken on during COVID, some of which maybe you could justify, some of which you can't justify.
Well,
and we could have that conversation.
It's interesting. Hold on. I just made a correlation here. When you tell me that I pay my mortgage and what, 80, 90% goes to the bank on interest and the principal, you said you didn't pay your principal for like a year. That's insane. That's like what the government's doing.
Not by
Well,
choice.
I'm not throwing you under the bus here.
Okay.
We got 2 minutes. Let's
Well,
make
if
it
you're going
quick.
to pay $81.8 billion in interest payments, you need to have a budget surplus in order to even pay that interest, and then dig a hole into the debt.
It is, but it's exactly what human beings are doing with their own mortgages. It's like 90% of what they loan out. It seems like such a waste to me that.
But at least they're paying down their principal of the mortgage. That's the difference. There's a principal and interest portion. We're not amortizing our national debt because we're running deficits. Therefore,
Okay, let me ask
we
this
can't pay
question.
it down.
Jay, give me a quick response to this one. When does it become too much debt?
I think we're there. I think we're
You
there.
think we're at the breaking point?
Well, we already had that conversation. You mentioned, and I'm not an economist, but you mentioned 60 to 80%. We're well over 100% in Canada. It's a dangerous place to be. Percent
Are
of GDP.
people feeling the affordability crisis partially because debt is so high?
Yes, I think.
Okay,
I think,
so we're all in agreement.
Yeah. So can I reference something that this
Yeah, go
gentleman
for it.
said back in the 1990s, where there was that, need from the public too? I think we've added some great programs on to healthcare. Childcare is a great one that I love, by the way. So now let's try maybe to control that, and let's have maybe that umph to pay down the debt a little bit and not grow those programs aggressively.
And like I spoke to a dental or a daycare program, and they're like, yeah, no, without this program, parents wouldn't even be able to afford, putting their kid in daycare. Okay, I get that, but then daycares are telling me that they're also underpaid because their rates haven't changed since 2017. So it's like, okay, is there just not enough money to go around? Do we just need more money? And that
also,
goes back to what you said.
If you want a program, it's got to be paid for. And over the past number of years, we've added all kinds of programs that aren't paid for. We didn't have room for it in the budget. There was no conversation. Of course, I wouldn't support it, but raising taxes to pay for it, there was no conversation about that. Governments lately have just decided that we're not generally going to propose raising taxes on the middle class.
So
what we're going to do is borrow the money and give people the services, but we're not going to have a conversation
We've
about
got 10
paying
seconds.
for it.
Give me a quick yes or no. Do we need to make a change in the way that we pay off our debt? Yes or no?
Absolutely.
Yes?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay, so we can all agree. Thank you. This is a tough conversation to follow, but we definitely want to hear from you, especially if I'm crazy or if Jay's crazy. But if you disagreed or feel we missed something important, join the conversation at MyGeneration on all social media platforms. We'll end off with this. Do not simply accept what you are told. Challenge your thinking, engage in differences, and listen to new perspectives. Jay, you're not crazy. I was just making a joke. Have a great night, everybody.